And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you briefly today's panel moderated by Dr. Kelly Mack. You can read the bios of the moderator and the panelists in your program book, but I want to give you some highlights. Margot Lee Shetterly is the author of Hidden Figures. If you have only seen the movie and not read the book, you must read the book. You'll understand why in about an hour. It is a meticulously researched account not only of the Black women depicted in the book, but the historic context of the story. I lived in Hampton, Virginia for over 40 years. The book told this incredible story of some of the women I knew and admired. One of these women is here today, Dr. Christine Doratan, retired NASA engineer in the Senior Executive Service. Among her many degrees, PhDs and all, are a BS degree in math education from Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, and an MS in applied math from Virginia State College, now Virginia State University. I'm giving shout outs to HBCUs this morning. You saw in the movie how difficult it was for the women to author technical papers at NASA. Dr. Doratan authored 57 such papers in the area of high-speed aerodynamics and sonic boom research. She's one of the leading experts in the world on sonic boom research. Also on the panel is the father of the author, Dr. Benjamin Lee, a retired NASA scientist. His bio says he authored approximately 240 technical papers. I guess he did lose count after about 200. Dr. Lee was, among other things, instrumental in space shuttle flight. What is interesting about him is that he earned his PhD after he retired from NASA. He received his PhD from Hampton University in physics with a concentration in atmospheric sciences and worked at Hampton University as a postdoctoral fellow for a number of years. And lastly, I'd like you to meet the moderator of this illustrious panel, my colleague and friend, Dr. Kelly Mack, Vice President for Undergraduate STEM Education and Director of Project Kaleidoscope at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. You see why Kelly is hard to introduce. She has the longest title in the world. She's an alumna of the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, where she received a degree in biology, and Howard University, where she received her PhD in physiology. Her bio says, Mack earned the BS and later the PhD. Well, I'll tell you, later was 5 years later, as in record time, whoever gets a PhD in 5 years. Kelly was on the faculty at UMass for 17 years, where she taught and was a cancer researcher. She's a tireless advocate for STEM undergraduate students and faculty at all institutions, but particularly at HBCUs. She fights daily for the inclusion of all. Dr. Mack and I are the co-founders of the Society for STEM Women of Color. Now, what you have been waiting for, our remarkable, accomplished panelists. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you to my panelists. So let me start off. How many have seen the movie? Okay, very good. So we're in good company. And read the book? Okay, that's okay. We're going to change that, just as Claudia suggested. I want to first start off by thanking you, Margot, for joining us today. And it's not in your bio. No one will probably mention it, but I think our audience needs to know what Herculean effort you made to get here. I've been hearing all week that you just took a red eye from the West Coast last night. You landed probably less than about an hour ago, rushed here, ate breakfast, and now you're sitting here. So thank you for joining us this morning. We are so happy to have you here. And I want to start off by thanking you, not just for telling our story to the world, but for giving us our story as well. For those of us who didn't know, for those of us who went to HBCUs, for giving us that pride back. that we so desperately needed, especially in these times. And I wanted to start our conversation off just by asking you about your inspiration for the book. I thought it was compelling how you talked about it in the first part of the book, in the early chapters, how you grew up and what you knew about these women.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it's an honor for me to share the panel with these individuals, Dr. Darden, my father.
Especially Dad.
Especially my dad. You know, the thing about it is the first face of science for me was black. The first face of college for me was HBCU, Norfolk State. My mom is right here, Dr. Margaret Lee. She went to Hampton University, so you know there was a lot of rivalry going back and forth there in the house. But so that was the baseline, but it really took all of my adult life. It was my husband, who is not here today, but who was the first one to ask the question that everybody asked, which is, why didn't we know the story before?
Yeah.
Listening to my father talk about some of the accomplishments of Katherine Johnson, Mrs. Kathleen Land, who was a former Sunday school teacher.
Right.
So that moment was a moment for me to look at this amazing upbringing that I had, and being very fortunate to have had that normalized, that, you know, African American and science and female did not have to be at odds, or HBCU graduate and scientist did not have to be at odds. But to see that as something that was valuable, not just for me, but
Right.
a story that might be valuable for other people as well.
Can I interrupt right here?
Absolutely.
If you didn't know it, Margot's background is in finances. And for the period from 91 to 2001, she was an investment banker on Wall Street. And that was up until 9/11. Also, she also served as a TV reporter in a program called Money Hunt. And she also did tourism and a lot of other things. She is truly an entrepreneur with a lot of persistence. And that kind of persistence really paid off in this book, because it took 5 years to finish. And Margot was a perfectionist. And she just kept on pushing, turning over every leaf.
Yep.
Going to Philadelphia, doing the research and everything. So
Right.
it takes a lot of persistence, and I knew she wanted to make sure that every name of every human computer
Yeah.
was documented and recorded, and their history, you know, put in a place where they would not be forgotten.
And you bring up such a good point. In the early chapters, it talks about how finding out about the women was one thing. Finding out about their contribution was something entirely different. And we did see in the movie how women weren't allowed to put their names on reports, how there was some secrecy around the work that was happening at Langley, that people just didn't talk about what was happening. So we can only imagine what it must have taken, what kind of research skills it must have taken to put together this book.
I mean, it was amazing because I really, you know, a lot of the initial conversations started with Katherine Johnson, who, you know, all of us kind of knew in Hampton.
What was that like? You have to tell us what that first meeting was like with Katherine Johnson.
I went with my mother and my husband. We sat on her couch, and she told the story that she's, you know, the first article that I found on her was in 1959.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so even before she had done the calculations for John Glenn's flight, or before John Glenn had gone up, she'd already done the work. They were already talking about Katherine Johnson. So she, you know, so she told us the story. One of the things that she said to me was, I never go anywhere without mentioning the accomplishments of Christine Darden. One of the things that she said to me was, Dorothy Vaughan was the smartest person I ever knew.
Yeah.
So, you know, and from there, it really was, you know, like my father said, like a really painstaking process of uncovering the names and their work.
Yeah, yeah.
And like there was a woman whose name is Dorothy Hoover, who you know, I think a lot of people had never heard of, who
Right.
had a very distinguished career, who came in the West Computing office in 1943. She ended up by 1952, she had co-authored 2 research reports, and she was classified as a GS9 research scientist. And by the time she actually went back, did some graduate work, she came back to NASA Goddard. So she was originally at Langley. She went back to Goddard. And in 1962, she was a GS13 research scientist with many, with papers under her belt. So, and this is a name that was among the many accomplished women that we have never heard about.
Absolutely. So your book picks up the story in the 1940s, which is amazing, I think. The movie only kind of catches us at 1960s and leaves, certainly me, wondering, well, how did they get there? Could you share that story with us?
So the thing is, the story starts in World War II. Like a lot of things in quote unquote modern, 20th century America, a lot of the seeds were sown in World War II. And so what happened is another name, in some ways a hidden figure, or maybe more like a forgotten figure, named A. Philip Randolph, who was a civil rights leader and a labor leader. He was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Pullmans, Porters, which was the largest black labor union in the country. And during World War II, and this was coming out of the Depression, a lot of people were obviously eager for these good war jobs, federal jobs, very good jobs. And they had been shut out since the time of Woodrow Wilson, who segregated the federal service. He segregated the civil service after coming out of Reconstruction. Anyway, so A. Philip Randolph went to then President Roosevelt and said, listen, if you do not integrate these war jobs for this impending World War II, we will march on Washington and bring 100,000 Negroes into the federal capital, right on the cusp of the war, which was something the president didn't want. He signed Executive Order 8802, which opened the war jobs not just to African Americans, but to Mexicans, to Poles, to Jews. There were many people who were redlined from those jobs that benefited from Mr. Randolph's actions. And then 2 years later, the first 5 black women, they had gone through a training class at Hampton University, then called Hampton Institute. The first 5 black women walked through the door at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory in my hometown, Hampton, Virginia.
Right. I want to just share one quote. See, I got so many notes, right? Because I had so much that I wanted to talk to you about. But there's a description in here about these women, the first ones that arrived. And you're right. The women in West Computing felt that if they didn't stand up to the pressure, they'd forfeit their opportunity, and maybe opportunity for the women who would come after them. They had more writing on the jobs at Langley than most. And so was that pretty much the stories that you've heard? And certainly, Christine, you must have felt that when you were there as well.
Certainly. The fact that they did so well, they were excellent in their jobs, I think opened the door for many of us who followed. And,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment that the women that you find at NASA and so forth, they are usually super achievers, great, whether they're secretaries, computer scientists, because usually they were at the top of their class.
Yes.
And rather than being a nurse or teaching, they had the opportunity to work for the government for quite a bit more pay. So it was not unusual to get the very best of the women working as human computers, working as secretaries at NASA.
And I'm so glad you brought up that they were at the top of their class, because I want to join my colleague Claudia in giving a shout out to all the HBCUs that are mentioned in the book, none of which were mentioned in the movie, by the way. But they are. Atlanta University, which is now what we refer to as Clark Atlanta University. Anybody here from Clark Atlanta? Okay, Clark Atlanta, good. Hampton University, I know Hampton is here. Howard University, Norfolk State University, Prairie View A&M, okay, Prairie View, Virginia State University, there you go, West Virginia State University. Oh, maybe they're still sleeping in or something. And Wilberforce University. Oh, okay, they must be sleeping too.
Also, don't forget North Carolina A&T.
And North Carolina A&T.
South Carolina State. North Carolina Central.
That's right.
Arkansas.
Okay, Florida
Is that the Arkansas?
That's Arkansas.
That was Dorothy Hoover's alma mater.
And
Famous
Dr.
graduate.
Dr. Hoover was the first professional person to be hired at NASA in 1943.
So I think it's important that for all of you at these institutions that you understand now the expectation that we have of the quality of the graduates of HBCUs. So I want to move, though, a little further into the story now and talk about what happened at these HBCUs, because I thought it was quite striking how, for much of what came out at that time around what we now call STEM, that there were presidents, there were leaders of these institutions that made conscious decisions that this was going to be the focus, whether it was the war effort, whether it was the war effort and this is how we're going to contribute to the war effort. But I think that it's so fitting for this conference because we're here, we've got so many emerging researchers in STEM that we are able to trace back to as early as World War II, probably even further if we really concentrated on it, how there were decisions that were made that put us on this trajectory of what HBCUs now do in terms of producing STEM graduates. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I found that in my research, but I think maybe what I should do is turn it over to these panelists because I think that, I grew up, and I'm sure your daughter grew up, as feeling like, understanding that science was equivalent to advancement in careers. And I think that came from their generation and before.
Well, looking at NASA Langley, there's a period of before 1960 and after 1960. Before 1960, the human computers came from the HBCUs.
Yes.
But there weren't much of a presence of black men at NASA Langley. And that came in the 50s, and those graduates like Jim Williams, Michigan State, 1951, Thomas Birdsong in 1952 also from Michigan State. The same year that Katherine Johnson joined the staff of Langley, and then it was Lawrence Brown in 1955. They came from the majority school, but something happened in 1960.
What happened?
1960, NASA came into being. President Kennedy became president. He said we are going to the moon. And with that, a lot of money was put into technology. And when money is put into a program, employment follows the funding. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of people being hired in technology, and there was a prominence and importance of being an engineer technologist. In the old days, in the 60s and earlier, engineer was really like a blue-collar worker. It wasn't revered like they are today in the space era. But after the 1960s, with the space program, money was put in. The HBCUs put more emphasis on science and technology. At Norfolk State, where I went, the head of our department, Dr. Woods, he's a hidden figure. He worked with the V-2 rockets from World War II. Mr. Taylor was excellent in optics, gave me my foundation in remote sensing and optics. we had a pretty big physics class. We had about 20 people, which was kind of large.
That is large.
Yeah, yeah. So money dictates what happens. So we saw the money go into technology, and the number of women and minorities just started growing. Back in 1984, Mary Jackson, which I worked with,
Really?
yeah, we wrote a paper. We did some trends on engineering, undergrad, hiring and retention and so forth. And we could see that everyone's doing a great job as far as getting women and minorities into STEM, but the problem was with the graduation rate. And the graduation rate was climbing, but by 1970s when NASA program changed, the funding changed, and went down, and NASA stopped funding a lot of programs for minorities and women because of their funding. Then we saw a decrease in the graduation rate because the students didn't have money. About 1980, it leveled off and then it started growing again. I cannot say what has happened since 1980. That was the last time I did study.
Slowly going up.
Because 1980 it leveled off, and it takes money to graduate. It's not a problem
It takes money.
of academics graduating.
Yes.
But you can get the students in the school, but they need money to stay in. Retention is very, very important.
So important.
Yeah.
So important.
I think one of the factors that Bob didn't mention was the fact that Sputnik went up in October of '57.
Yeah.
And that sent shivers through the school system of America and started this emphasis on STEM and science, and our people have to get there. How did they beat us up there? And that was a great impetus to what Kennedy did and everything.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm kind of hoarse. I'm just so proud being near my daughter.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you should be, as well you should be. We're proud of her too. We absolutely are, and we thank you for the gift of her.
And my wife,
And
Margaret.
of course, Mrs. Thank you. So we've had the HBCU experience, and we have these women coming out of HBCUs, and they arrive at Langley. And we know that it wasn't easy. And Christine, I want you to talk about, if you would, just what it was really like. Particularly, I'd like to start with the bathroom scene, because it is a very compelling scene in the movie, but it's not nearly as compelling as the way our Margot describes it. And so I just want to share that with everyone. It's going to take a minute, but I think that this is worth hearing. Negotiating racial boundaries was a daily fact of life, of Negro life. Mary wasn't naive about segregation at Langley. It was no different than anywhere in town. Yet she couldn't shake this particular incident. It was the proximity of professional equality that gave the slight such a surprising and enduring sting. Unlike the public schools where minuscule budgets and ramshackle facilities exposed the sham of separate but equal, the Langley employee badge supposedly gave Mary access to the same workplace as her white counterparts. Compared to the white girls, she came to the lab with as much education, if not more. She dressed each day as if she were on her way to a meeting with the president. She trained the girls in her Girl Scout troop to believe that they could be anything, and she went to lengths to prevent negative stereotypes of their race from shaping their internal views of themselves. It was difficult enough to rise above the silent reminders of colored signs on the bathroom doors and cafeteria tables, but to be confronted with the prejudice so blatantly, there in that temple to intellectual excellence and rational thought, by something so mundane, so ridiculous, so universal as having to go to the bathroom. In the moment when the white women laughed at her, Mary had been demoted from professional mathematician to a second-class human being, reminded that she was a black girl whose piss wasn't good enough for the white pot. Excellent, outstanding writing, thank you. But Christine, tell us.
Well, I did not encounter that. I went in 1967, and there were no bathroom issues at that time. I guess when the bathrooms started out, they were mostly for males, so sometimes they actually had to convert to female bathrooms because they didn't have many women around. And so there were those issues before I got there. But no, the bathrooms, all of the buildings had bathrooms. They were all integrated bathrooms, no separations. And the segregated computers were not there when I went there. The West computers had ended with the formation of NASA in '58. And so I went into a computer pool that had a white head computer, and there was actually one white and one other black in the office, and me. And so those things had changed, and I really don't remember much overt prejudice to me. We were a support group. The engineers would bring their work in and give it to the head computer, and she would assign it to somebody, and you did the equation or whatever it was you were supposed to do, and then gave it back to them, and that was sort of the end of it. After I'd been there about a year or so, there was an accident in a tunnel, and another group of ladies moved in, which actually brought a Negro head computer and a couple of other Negroes in the office. And so things worked pretty well. One of the things I remember originally was with the white head computer, I could only get a cup of coffee at 10 o'clock. That was my coffee break. That was the coffee break in the office, and that wasn't just me. It was everybody in the office could get a cup of coffee at 10 o'clock. Yeah, and so that was very rigid and something very unexpected to me, but that's the way it was.
And so were your interactions then with other Black women and Black men at Langley different from how you interacted from your white colleagues at all?
Well, maybe the black, if I encountered a black person in the building somewhere, they were probably more likely to speak and introduce themselves and that. So I probably got to know them first, yes. But I did, you know, especially if they had to come in the office with work, you would meet them. And I actually had some difficulties telling them apart sometimes. That was, I actually asked the question one day, why is it sometimes when this man walks in, you call him Bob, and then the next day you call him Jim? And they said, but maybe it's because they are two different people.
That's not funny.
But I think it speaks to the level of interaction that you have with people on a daily basis,
that's true.
or lack thereof.
That's true.
Absolutely. And then, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that Chris worked in the Human Computer West group.
I did not work in the West.
Oh, you did not?
No, that ended in '58, and I
Okay.
came in '67.
Okay, well, in the branch and the sections I worked in, we had human computers. I could not give my work to a human computer because only the boss had the right to get the human computer to do his work. The rest of us, we had to do our own computations. So a human computer was a very prestigious position to have, and the person worked with you. And it made it very easy for you to do your analysis. And one good thing about it, if you're a researcher, research takes a lot of time. It takes patience. And if you are constantly running the computers, manipulating your algorithms and so forth, that leaves very little time to look at your data. So a human computer provides you a powerful tool in that you had someone that gave you the extra time to look at your data, to understand what was really going on. And if you had a human computer, it really accelerated you a long ways in your research.
So, from the movie, it was the engineers that were highly revered, not the computers.
Right.
But you're saying that the computers were.
Now, to me, to me, if I had a computer, I would have been very happy because I would have had someone to do my work. So I had to do my own typing, had to do my own computations. We had secretaries, but usually the boss had control of the secretaries and the human computers. So as an engineer, you had to be talented. You had to be able to type. You had to be able to do your own computations. So human computers provide a very, very powerful tool to a researcher that you could have more time to do the analysis and really do your job. So if I had a human computer, I would really appreciate that person.
I would have too, if I had been there.
Yeah. Anyone to help you do your job.
But then, you think I'm kidding, but I'm serious. But then, the experience for black men, worse than what it was for black women? Better than? The same? Or just different?
It was different. It was different. With human computers, in the early days, before Christine, they worked as a group, so they had a lot of support. Not only black men, also black women that worked at NASA as a researcher. Usually, you worked in an organization, you were the only person, so there was no one there to really be a mentor to tell you what it took to succeed, what you had to do as a researcher, the importance of the system and the ins and outs, the rituals and everything about being a team member, being a member of the basketball team, the football team. Things like the only way in the scientific community, and you all can speak to us, you got to count, right?
Yep.
In science technology, you don't know anything unless you can count it and measure it.
Right.
Well, same thing in scientific areas. Your boss can't tell how great you are, how smart you are. So the way they count you is they look at the number of publications you put out, the number of talks you give. So if you want to succeed in research, you got to publish. You got to write those papers because there's no other way people can measure how good you are. So it's a counting system. You're always being counted. You're accounted what time you get to work in the morning, right? If you're on time, your boss can say, hey, that's a good worker. They look at you going to lunch. If you take a half an hour for lunch, it's just a very diligent person. If you take a long lunch break, they can count that.
You're lazy.
If you stay late after work, people say that's a hard worker. If you leave early, it's
Lazy
always
again.
the counting system. So we all count. And in research, it's very hard to tell the quality of your research. So what happens in research, people rely heavily upon counting the number of publications. And I learned that at a very late stage in my career. I wish I had known about it when I first hit Langley, so I would have been able to run, because I used to say to myself, oh, I'd be just happy to just have one publication with my name on it only. But I found out if you're a researcher, it's not just you, it's a team. They count, and the way you count is you work with other people. They write a publication. They put your name on. There are 5 of you working as a group, and each of you put out a publication. Instead of just having one publication, there's 5. So when you go up for promotion, you have 5 to count with, not 1.
So what counted for the women computers, though? Because they couldn't put their names on publications.
Yes,
So
that's true.
How did you know when you had a good one and a not so good one?
Quality, I'm going to be very truthful with you. It's very hard to tell quality because quality is very subjective. Because if you are doing research and you support my work, I think it's great.
Okay.
If you're doing research and it counters what I'm doing, I don't think that's great. And if you're doing research that enhances my work, I think it's great. It's subjective. It's very subjective.
The women that were in West Computers, in fact, they would be asked to come and support a section, for a certain job or something. And I know of several instances, Catherine was one, when they had someone to come and work, And they were able to identify how good their work was.
Yeah.
You know, this is somebody we would like to keep. They would ask them to stay.
Right.
And so that happened to Catherine. I think it happened to Mary Jackson. And to the new head computer that came into my office, she had been a West computer, and she had been called to a gas dynamics group and asked to stay because they were impressed with her work ethic and the quality of her work. So some of them did get pulled out, and they actually worked in groups and stayed there.
And so while we,
going back to the question, what it really boils down to, engineers and scientists were they were prima donnas, okay? What it meant is that people that were technicians, human computers, people in the lab that supported them to produce the work, they really did not give them the proper kind of credit, including the human computers.
true.
The technicians that helped them generate the data, they did not allow them to be on the reports either. The secretaries that worked hard and double-checked their work, made sure that the grammar and all that was good, and they did not get credit.
Unfortunately.
Engineers were very particular. They didn't want to give anyone a co-authorship on the paper. They would acknowledge you, but they would not make you an author. If you wanted to be an author, you had to work on something and write it completely on your own and bring others as co-authors, because it was very important being the first author. But you bring up the question about why women weren't able to be authors. That's very, very true. It was also true of technicians that were men.
Okay.
And so forth. It went to all the other support groups that supported engineers and scientists. They weren't allowed to be authors either.
And so I want to shift a little bit from what work productivity looked like and from what work success looked like to what home productivity and home success looked like, and what work-life balance looked like for these women.
She had been assigned to a shop in the materials area, or structures, one of them. And she came in and she says, well, you know, they showed me all the equipment in the shop, and then they sort of left me, you know, and I'm just kind of sitting here. And I said, oh, well, gosh. I said, I do know somebody over there, and I'll give them a call, but I would suggest you do one thing. I said, all of the people who work over there, their papers on bookcases in the hall. And so you can walk down that hall and you can see what kind of work each person is doing. I said, pick up a couple of those papers and ones that interest you, and read those papers, and maybe come up with some questions or some things in those papers that really interest you. And then look at the names on the doors in the hall and go to the author of the papers and say, you know, I was just reading your report, and I was wondering if I could just talk to you a little bit about, you know, some of the things you have in here. And just ask questions, or say, you know, that really interests me, and I wish I could do some more, or so forth and so on. And she went on back to her work and everything. By the end of that summer, both she and her mother came to me and said that was some of the best advice you could have given my daughter. For her to be proactive and show somebody what she'd like to do and that she was interested in doing it, and to be complimentary on somebody's work is a good way to get in with that somebody.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I haven't seen her anymore, but apparently it was working well for her. And so we need to do good work. We need to speak up. And if we desire goals and places we want to be, we need to let somebody know that.
Okay.
If we need help, we need to ask for help. If we think we might be over our heads. So ask for it before you fail in the job. And if you've been given a menial task, you know, finish the task, do it well, but then ask for something extra and tell somebody you'd like to move into some other areas. Because I think that's what it takes. And that's ultimately what I had to do. And I actually thought that I was a little late doing it. But I was to the point where I said, well, I will quit and go back to teaching if I have to. But it worked out for me. But I was willing to take that step.
Good advice. I
One,
like that.
one of the things I have to say that I learned from your story and the stories of a lot of these other women is do not take no for an answer. You know, don't take no for an answer. I mean, the scene in the movie where Katherine Johnson has to ask over and over and over and
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
to be in the meeting, you know, was dramatized a little bit, but that really happened.
Yeah.
You know, it took her a long time to get into the room where it happens. And then once she did, you know, that was the pathway to her doing the work of her career. But that was the one thing I learned from her and all these women is just, you know, people will often just tell you no at first. And the first no is not always the last no if you keep asking.
I always tell people I dated a guy once who told me that no was the first step to a yes. Another way of thinking about
Well, there you are, there you are.
what you just said.
Don't take no for an answer. Yeah,
What
at
about
work.
you, Dr. Lee? Any messages? Scriptures, advice, go-to quotes?
Advice, be like Christine and Margot. Be persistent. I mean, don't give up. Just keep on chugging along. As they said, don't accept no, but you got to have the patience and the strength and the endurance and the desire to keep on going. A lot of times, you know, it's very difficult. That persistence really pays off. If you're a graduate student, you need persistence because you can't graduate without persistence. You got to have persistence to keep going when things don't seem right. So,
And there are going to always be obstacles.
yeah.
There will always be
yeah.
something.
Absolutely. If you keep living, there will always be an obstacle.
Yeah, I just want to say that I really appreciate this opportunity to stand here right next to my daughter. I'm so proud of her. It brings tears to my eyes.
We are proud of her too.
I'm telling you,
We really are.
really proud
And we're
of
so
Margaret.
grateful for her
Yes.
and for
Thank you.
telling our
It's
story
my honor
so
to
well.
be here. This is a great day.
She taught me more about my workplace than I ever knew. No, truly. I worked at NASA for 40 years and I didn't know anything until I opened up Margot's book.
Well, especially the early years,
Yeah,
I learned
yeah.
a lot too. I learned a lot of things. In fact, you wrote how somebody helped me get a promotion that I didn't know anything about either.
Yeah, it was fascinating. It was a really interesting time with a lot of people who did outstanding work, and at the same time, they got up every day and went to work and didn't talk about it. And,
Yeah.
you know, came home and, you know, we saw our parents and, you know, we saw people in the grocery store and saw people at church and, you know, they were doing this world-changing work. And yet, you know, they were people who had all these amazing facets to their lives and, you know, didn't go around talking about all the things that they did at work. And yet, you know, we're doing absolutely spectacular research and changing the world.
Well, I actually had a friend say to me the other day, you know, back in 1970 when I met you and I said, what do you do? And you said, I'm an aerospace engineer. We just dropped our mouths open. They didn't say any more. So I don't think folks knew enough to ask you what you really did. And I think even though you might have said you were doing these things, they didn't really know what you were talking about. And so now they said they never heard of it.
Well, I want to ask you two, everybody asked the question, why haven't we heard the story before? And I want to know what you guys think.
I was going to say, when I was growing up, my father worked for the Navy. And I used to ask my dad all the time. I said, Dad, what do you do? He said, I can't tell you. Sink, loose lips sink ships.
Yeah.
When you work for the government, they prohibit you from talking about what you did. When I first started working at Langley in 1964, I had a secret badge, top secret. I was a student, a co-op. And I was wondering to myself, why in the world I got a secret badge when I look at what we're doing, and I could not understand why I was top secret. So everybody walking around with top secret badges in areas which I think really aren't top secret, and everyone said, don't talk about your work because it's a government secret. So during that early period of time, Now, people did not talk about their work working for the government because they consider everything to be a top secret. Later on, they declassified things so that you could talk about your work. So all those years, I didn't know what my daddy did. Later on, after he retired, he started telling me what he did. And I think we don't know the story because in those days, people had this mentality of national defense, don't tell anybody what you do and things like that. So a lot of stories. Those engineers and scientists that worked at NASA, people don't know their stories either.
True.
Because they
Very
tell
true.
you, don't talk about your work.
Very true.
I kind of have a different perspective of that because I worked in a secret area. And when I was in a secret area, you were behind a locked door. You could not walk out of the office without locking up everything in safes and everything like that. I actually ran computer codes over in ACD, and we got into the question, well, what happens if there's a fire drill? Because we had a fire drill one day, and they said, well, if the alarm goes off, you are supposed to blow every fuse in that computer and leave, which means, you know, you've destroyed everything. So they said, so you need to know if it's going to be a fire drill or not. So when I was, I mean, you didn't want to destroy it, and it's just a drill. Yeah. So when I was working in that area, I don't even remember the title of the reports that I wrote when I was in a secret area. But when I was working in Sonic Boom, I was working with the people in Japan and England, and so the people around around the planet that worked in the same thing, I actually knew them. Because they would come over here to get papers at conferences, and we would go to conferences and discuss and, you know, come up with ideas about how maybe this could be solved and things like that. And I mean, I think I talked about it if people ask about it, but you know, folks' eyes glass over sometimes when you start talking about certain things too. And they don't know what you're talking about anyway. And I think that's the instance in many instances. They don't really want to hear the depths of what you're doing unless it's some very fabulous thing or something. But the secret things, you were right. You didn't mention that at all.
Yeah.
But they were stamped secret, and you would get in lots of trouble.
Absolutely. I'm getting the signal that
Time is
we
up.
should open up our discussion to all of you. So while we're waiting for someone to join us in the conversation, I've never had anyone write my story. But after you read your story, did it make you different in any way?
When other people read it, you know, they would mention things to me. That I
Right.
think that certainly was maybe a happy feeling, a proud feeling. Proud that Margot included me in the book because I was somewhat removed from the first three. I've gotten a lot of people calling me.
Good.
You travel almost as much as I do.
Margot, are you different after having written it, now that it is everything that it is now?
I'm going to get to write another book.
Okay. What's
So
that one
that's
about?
that's probably, I mean, you know, I think I'm the same person, but you know, I have a tremendous appreciation of this history, which is sort of my origin story, really. This history that, you know, happened in my backyard, and, you know, understanding, you know, really feeling when I drive up and down Mercury Boulevard in Hampton, Virginia, that doesn't happen without thinking about Project Mercury, that, you know, gave it the name, and all of these women that worked for the space program. And so, yeah, but I think, you know, probably the biggest thing for me is that of the many, many career changes that I've had, which my father talked about, you know, I now consider myself a professional writer.
And she wants to tell untold stories.
And
Yes.
there are more stories to tell.
Oh, yeah, a lot of stories.
A lot of stories to tell.
We have one question.
Yeah, the young lady in the back was first, and then
Okay.
the three persons who lined up. So,
Hi, I wanted to ask Christine Darnett if you could just encapsulate your research in terms of the impact that it had on the space program.
Okay, my research was in aeronautics. It was sonic boom minimization, which in the late 1960s and 70s the English, the French, the Russians, and the Americans were all talking about building a supersonic transport, commercial transport. The United States and England did a lot of flight tests over Chicago, over Oklahoma City, looking at the impact of the sonic boom which accompanies a supersonic airplane. Military aircraft were used to do all these flight tests. People called in talking about their sheetrock was cracked or their windows broke or things like that. Because of the complaints that the United States got, they canceled their SST program. The English and French built the Concorde, which most of you have probably heard of. It flew from 1976 until maybe 10 years ago. The Russians built the Tu-144, but it had an accident at an air show in Paris and caught a fire, and so it never flew outside of Russia, and it was only used as a cargo airplane. And so the Concorde flew from Paris to New York or London to Washington, D.C. But those were the only routes that they could fly because the United States and countries around the globe created laws or passed laws that there could be no supersonic commercial flight over land. So when the Concorde is flying, it could only fly over water. So they only sold 13 of those airplanes. And when you think of the millions of dollars that it took to develop the Concorde, they didn't recover any of their money. So it never made any money for the governments or the aircraft companies that bought those airplanes. And so there was still pressure in this country that we'd like to go fast. We'd like for Margot to get from Seattle to Washington in an hour instead of 4 hours. We would like for people to get from Los Angeles to Australia in 6 hours instead of 14 hours, kinds of things. And so this is why we were doing this sonic boom minimization. After we did the wind tunnel test and everything, and we got a design that we thought would work, we actually took a military vehicle and padded it with extra volume to match the area that we thought we needed. We flew them in California, and we said, this really works. This does reduce the sonic boom. Well, Boeing says, we need for you to combine this now with an efficient supersonic airplane, fly it at 35, 40,000 feet, measure those signatures, let the people in this room hear those signatures and say they could live with the noise that would still occur. NASA is supposed to be getting 2 X-planes in 2017, 2018. One is supposed to be a supersonic airplane, which does that. So we've been waiting ever since 2002 to get the money to build a full-size supersonic airplane that has the low boom characteristics and it is an efficient supersonic airplane. It's been through one of the design reviews, but the government, I think, is still in a continuing resolution, and we don't know what's going to happen to 2018 as far as the funding is concerned. So that's where we sit on actually demonstrating to people and to the Boeing aircraft company and other Gulfstream that this really works. To go to the FAA and said, we've got all these people who are willing to testify that that level of noise is acceptable, so that they could remove the laws that exist in this country and around the world. So we didn't go to the moon or anything. We're still waiting to demonstrate that we can operate here on this planet.
Let me say something real quick. Christine Darden really helped me and NASA because the sonic boom work showed that supersonic transport could destroy ozone. As a result of that, a lot of ozone research developed. A lot of money went into environmental quality. I was working on global climate change. So that work gave NASA the funding to do climate change. And we are still living off of that research that allowed us to look closer at our environment for climate change.
Fascinating.
When
Thank
that
you.
supersonic plane flies, we will think of Christine Darrow. Absolutely. Okay. The young ladies in front.
Hi, my name is Zoe Vaughn. I can only hope that I'm related to Dorothy Vaughn. I attend the University of Buffalo, and
Would
my
you
question...
speak up a little bit?
I attend the University of Buffalo, and my question is for the author, Ms. Shutterly. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. We talked a little bit about the differences between the book and the movie. So in your opinion, was there anything lost in like translation from the book to the movie? Did you enjoy the movie? How in general do you feel about the differences?
Honestly, I really love the movie. I'm very happy with the adaptation at the end, although it took me a long time to understand what it means to adapt a literary work into a film, you know, and so this was my first book. The movie people optioned my book proposal, so it wasn't even a book when they started working on the movie. So these two things were happening simultaneously. So every once in a while, you know, I get a call from the producer, or I get the screenplay or something and read it and, you know, kind of throw a hissy fit, like this didn't happen in real life, I can't believe it's changed. And, you know, and thankfully, a lot of my suggestions were not listened to because I don't think the movie would have been as good. And then there were several things though where I really kind of put my foot down and said, you know what, that you cannot make that change. That is just simply too far off what the story and the essence of the people are about. Like, it can't happen that way. And they were very good about listening to me. But I learned a lot about what the difference between a good nonfiction book and what you have to do to make a book, and you know, what you have to do to tell the same kind of story, the spirit of the story, in a movie that is going to keep people interested in a dark theater for 2 hours. So, you know, that means changing timelines and characters and, you know, so that, you know, but all in all, I was very happy with the final product of the film.
Thank you.
Mary Benjamin, University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. That was my question. So I will use this opportunity to thank AAA at Science for providing this panel for us and all that was done by HBCU, because it not only gives us an idea of what the pioneers did for us, but it gives us hope for the future, and it lets us know how we can bring business into the sciences and make the whole universe more informed. So thank you so much.
Good morning, I'm Regina Fosfett. I don't have a question, but I just want to let you know what an impact you have made on so many people. When I read the book, I saw the movie, my husband and I both cried, because I used to be on the D&C of the financial section, and anytime we had a senatorial dinner, John Glenn would always sit at my table. And he said one evening, you know, you have such spunk. You remind me of someone I know. Well, until I read the book, and definitely when I saw the movie, I knew who he meant. And that brought a joy to my heart. And I just want to thank you. Hopefully I can get you to sign my book, because I want to send it to my granddaughter who lives in Norway with her father and mother, because I want her to know what opportunities that she has in this world, this planet. Thank you.
The young man was next.
Hello, my name is Oshawn Marshall. I'm from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And my question is, the panel has spoken about privacy and secrecy both in the government and at NASA. As a computer scientist, I have the option to go either in the public sector or the private sector. So my question is, if you want to make the discoveries and the innovations that will help propel humanity forward and make it more open for people, which direction would be the best to facilitate that?
I think I can answer that question. When I graduated from Norfolk State many, many years ago, 50 years ago, really, to tell the truth. I had to make that decision. I worked at NASA as a cooperative training student, intern, so I had the opportunity to look at what research was about and a little bit of applied research. I was the kind of guy that I wanted to discover things. And private industry, to me, they pay you a lot more money. They were paying me 50 to 100% more. But I did not want to make a widget. I did not want to make a product. I want to just do basic research. If you want to do basic research, government installations and the universities are the places to go. Private industry, they are based upon profit. So when you're doing research for them, you got to turn a profit. If that profit is not, if that product you're working on isn't turning a profit, then they'll get rid of you. And you don't do basic research. They won't let you hobby shop. They won't let you do basic research. So if you want to do basic research, universities and colleges are probably the best places to go because they get grants. And they produce a report, but they produce a lot of basic research knowledge, the sort of things that you love to do if you are a peer researcher. But if you want to make money, private industry is a place to go, but you won't do much in terms of research. So I was a researcher, so I went to the government, and I wanted to go to grad school, and they also send you to grad school. So the government is where you do research, universities, research, private industry, you are producing a product that makes some money. So that's the difference.
Thank you for your time.
The young lady in the back.
Good morning. I'm Mizani Walker from Kennesaw State University. My question is for Mrs. Sheederly. I wanted to know, as a writer, you have the wonderful opportunity to step outside of yourself and express the viewpoint of someone else and their story. So I wanted to know, what were your tactics to express the women in your book and what they were going through?
That's a great question. I mean, it is one thing to write your own story. It's another thing to have responsibility for someone else's story, and I felt tremendous responsibility. So I spent as much time as I could with Christine, with Catherine, who is 98 years old. She's still very much in command of her story. With the children of all the people that I wrote about, with the colleagues of those people, really tried any little bit of detail. I mean, I looked at photos for hours. I looked at seating charts. I looked at phone books. I read all of the research and learned a tremendous amount from all of the research reports that I read. And then there were some things where I had to make a leap of faith. But for example, I have been in a work situation where I was the only woman or black woman or both, and kind of struggling to say, well, do I have the guts to say to the boss, I think you're wrong, or I want to get promoted, or I want to get paid more, or felt like I couldn't say that or whatever. So there were, some of it was also having to take the leap from, even after having done all of the exhaustive research from the interviews and the archival documents, kind of really understanding the situations and also understanding, this was my community as well. This was the place that I grew up, and people that, I knew and understood and understood where they came from. So, but it's, it was a tremendous responsibility that I felt to tell the stories as closely as I could in the voices and through the eyes of the people who were the protagonists in this story.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Christina Young, and my question is directed to Ms. Shitterly. I was wondering if you had to go through a review process through when giving the interviews, or did you just needed their permission?
I'm sorry, did I what?
Did you go through a special review process for the interviews that you conducted, or did you just need their permission to write the book?
A special review process, like an internal
process
review
for
process
interviewing.
or human subjects assurances.
I see. Oh, right. Yeah. So we interviewed, and then once I had a sort of draft of the chapters that involved each person, I sent it to them so they could review and correct and weigh in on those portions of their life. Is that the
Thank
question?
you.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, my name is Chibu. My question is for Ms. Shitterly as well. I wanted to know if you're looking into writing more stories about other scientists and minorities or women as well, and perhaps it leading towards more films.
I am sort of in the process of shaping up the next two projects, two books. One of them, both of them are mid-century African American stories, very much concerned with social mobility and the American dream and work identity. The same way this story focuses on science and NASA and the government, the next story really focuses on the media and entrepreneurship, and that as a means for social mobility and work. And then the final story actually does concern scientists and has an international angle. So I'm in the process now of trying to find the time to start working on the next thing.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is DeAndrea Harper, and I'm from North Carolina Central University. My question is for the entire panel. I'd like to talk about how basically there's the perception of science being inaccessible or only meant for geniuses, and how you feel about how things like Hidden Figures and increasing prioritization of STEM education has affected that perception.
That was a lot, so I heard.
She was saying that the perception is science is only for geniuses. And would you talk a little bit about the accessibility?
I will tell you that when I went to college, to major in mathematics. I came with an Algebra 1 and a geometry class. And so I was starting pretty much from zero. I learned to love math in my geometry class, and then my father said, get a teacher certificate. So to take the other math classes that were offered at Hampton, I took my senior year 4 math classes and did student teaching each semester. So I took extra math to catch up with all the math and physics in some instances that I had not had. And I did the same thing when I was teaching for 3 years. That was the driving to Virginia State to take the classes there. And it was after I got the master's degree in applied math that I applied to NASA, and probably why I was accepted at NASA, because I would not have been as I finished high school.
Could you repeat the question again?
How do you think the increasing prioritization of making STEM education more accessible has affected the perception that it's only for geniuses? Like, while excellence in doing extremely well at what you're doing, it seems like, makes it seem like everyone who's very accomplished in science is some kind of genius, or
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because I think actors and actresses are geniuses, because I've met a few people that can look at a sheet of paper, turn away, and recite every line on that page. Actors and actresses, they are really geniuses in that they can take a script and memorize it that quick and go through it. That kind of photographic memory tells to me that person is a genius. Scientists and engineers, they're more like developed. I mean, you do a lot of math, you do a lot of science. When I was in high school, Booker T. Washington, Norfolk, I took the calculus, I took the chemistry, the physics, all those sort of things before I went to college, and I participated in a lot of math and science congresses, participating who's the best in algebra, calculus, solid geometry, and all that. So I had a whole lot of training. Now look at the other people in the sciences. They had that similar kind of training. They had a lot of training in math and science. Some people can pick it up very quickly. I wouldn't necessarily say that scientists and engineers are geniuses. There are a lot of great people geniuses in English, arts, and so forth. So I wouldn't say that you will have to be a genius to be a scientist engineer. I think no matter what you do, you got to be persistent. You got to believe in what you want to do, and you just got to stick to it. I think that some people have quicker minds than others, but you'll eventually get there if you keep on working at it. My son, I was so, and Margot and my daughters, I wanted them to be scientists. They didn't turn out that way. They turned out to be great geniuses, but not in science and engineering. So you just can't look at scientists and engineers as geniuses. Everyone, no matter what they do, they can be a geniuses. Whether they believe at the point that they want to be the very best and perfect it. And geniuses are considered to be perfectionists. You know, they know all about it. And you can choose any subject and become a genius. Some people do it quicker. They have a quicker mind. Some people have a slower mind. We all get there sometimes. So I don't think if you don't think you're a genius and you want to be an engineer or scientist, I don't think it should stop you. You got to be persistent. You just got to keep on working there.
So I thank you very much for your questions.